Islamic Society of North America held their annual convention last weekend in Washington, D.C. Next is a panel which focused on the origins of September 11th. Participants discussed how the events of that day can be attributed to U.S. foreign policy and the current state of the Islamic movement. It's an hour and a half.
This. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We start in the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. This will be session number 12B. There are other parallel sessions, like 10 or more of them right now. And we are in the convention of ISNA, the 39th annual convention. ISNA stands for Islamic Society of North America. The theme of this convention is Islam for Peace and Justice. Last year, our convention was held in Chicago. More than 30,000 people attended. This year, about 35,000, and we are still counting. The theme of this session is 9/11, Beyond the Blame Game, between flawed U.S. foreign policy and distortions in Muslim societies. We have a keynote speaker, Professor Akbar Ahmed, on my left, and then we have three discussants, Dr. Mumtaz Ahmad and Dr. Ingrid Mattson and Dr. Louay Safi, who is joining us soon. We'll start with presentation of Professor Akbar Ahmed. Professor Akbar is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies and Professor of International Relations at American University in Washington, D.C. Professor Ahmed is a distinguished anthropologist, a writer, and a filmmaker. He has been actively involved in interfaith dialogue and the study of global Islam and its impact on contemporary society. He is also the author of many books: Discovering Islam, Making Sense of Muslim History and Society, and Islam Today, A Short Introduction to the Muslim World. Another book, The Future of Anthropology, Its Relevance to the Contemporary World. Professor Akbar Ahmed has been teaching in several universities, in Princeton University, Harvard University, Cambridge University, and several others. He will start to talk on this theme, 9/11, Beyond the Blame Game, between flawed U.S. foreign policy and distortions in Muslim societies. Professor Akbar Ahmed, please.
Thank you for that very warm introduction. September the 11th threw up several important central questions, but long overdue questions. Many of us scholars have been grappling with these questions for many years. In fact, one of the books that my distinguished colleague mentioned, Discovering Islam, raised precisely these questions. These questions are: does the Quran encourage violence? Is Islam compatible with democracy? What is Islam's attitude to women? These are central questions, not only for Muslims, but non-Muslims, because there's a relationship, a dynamic, ongoing relationship between Muslim societies and non-Muslim societies, which is the theme of our session this afternoon. Unfortunately, these questions now came bursting out of the Pandora's box on September 11, on that terrible, fateful day, and became part of the public domain and part of the public debate. So let me very briefly go through these questions. First of all, why is Islam important? Why are we even looking at these questions? Why not other world civilizations? It is important to step back and remember we are talking of a civilization with almost 1.3 billion people, a civilization growing, 55 states, one state which is nuclear, And most important, something like 25 million Muslims living permanently in the West. 7 million in America, 2 million in the United Kingdom. Then there's a war on terrorism, which now takes center stage on the world level. And in this war, Muslims are again participants. They are allies of America. We know that the war is being fought in Afghanistan. It has an impact on Pakistan. There are repercussions in the Middle East, the Arab world. Once again, the importance for all of us to understand Islam. So the first question, back to the basics, the Quran itself. Does the Quran preach violence? Every Muslim must look in his heart and answer this. Every non-Muslim must make an attempt to grapple with this question. The answer is brief. No, no, and no. The greatest attributes of God in Islam, out of the 99 glorious names of Islam, the greatest attributes are Rahman and Rahim, compassion and mercy. The greatest title given to the Prophet of Islam is a mercy to the worlds. Now, God could have given him some other title. God could have said the sword of humanity. God could have said the judge of humanity. But God chose the word mercy to the worlds. So mercy is being emphasized here. For Muslims, Jesus symbolizes mercy and compassion and love, and again reflects the Judeo-Christian traditions of Islam itself. Indeed, very few people know, but every Muslim, every day when he prays or she prays, millions of Muslims all over the world are actually praying blessings to Abraham and his descendants. So once again, the links with a broader tradition outside Islam. So Islam cannot, by definition, be preaching violence, however much some Muslims may interpret it in that way. So this is a great challenge for us Muslims to be able to clarify. Yet we have the stark reality of the 19 hijackers who were all Muslim. So what kind of Muslims were they? Who is teaching them? What is in their minds? What educational system, what political system creates these people who are prepared to kill innocent, totally innocent people, which is forbidden categorically in the Quran itself? We have a major crisis within society. And this moves me to my next point, which is the link between what is happening in America and America's foreign policy, and the element of disjunction between the two positions. So we look at the world outside America, and we look at the Muslim world in particular, and we see problems. Problems in Palestine, in Kashmir, in Chechnya. We see Muslims unhappy, suppressed, demanding rights. My own country, Pakistan, since 1947, when it came into being, was solidly behind and in the American camp. It was understood. It was the time of the Cold War, and Pakistan was very much with America. Yet I look at Pakistan today. Churches are being bombed. Hospitals are being bombed. And I'm shocked. A visitor like Danny Pearl, who's come to report on Pakistan with sympathy, is killed in the most brutal manner. And I ask myself, what is going on? Why are suddenly Pakistanis turning away from a traditionally pro-American position to a position of hatred against America? And for these questions to be answered, we have to be looking at both the political leadership in the Muslim world, which I see as now increasingly isolated from the mainstream Muslim society, from Muslim society itself, to the point when Karzai in Kabul has to be guarded by American troops, to the point when President Musharraf in Pakistan is now commonly referred to as Bush Sharraf, meaning that he's like a clone of President Bush over here in America. We are then raising questions within our own society. Which leads me now to my second question. Is Islam compatible with democracy? Here the answer again is a simple one. And the answer is a clear, unambiguous yes, in the affirmative. There is no incompatibility. Let me give you a very interesting historical example, which will be instructive both to Americans and to Pakistanis. Thomas Jefferson and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the two great founding fathers, both, and they would pay a study, both reflect the respect for human dignity, for democracy, for education, for human rights, for women's rights. This is a very important point I'm making. I would encourage Americans to understand Muhammad Ali Jinnah so that they answer this question. And I would urge Muslims to appreciate and encourage their study of Thomas Jefferson so that they understand that the idea of a human society rooted in these universal ideals is not exclusive. It is not the preserve of one society or the other society. These are universal values, and we as societies have to move towards these universal values. Incidentally, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the great founder of Pakistan, was also a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln. So there are many connections between America and Pakistan in terms of an understanding of democracy. The big question for us, and a distinguished scholar like Professor Mumtaz could address this, is what happened? How did America take one path and Pakistan take another path? And these are questions that have to be answered. This leads me to another point which I want to raise this afternoon, which is the importance, the central importance of education in Islamic society. The word for knowledge in Islam is ilm, and it is so important in Islam that ilm, the word for knowledge, is used more than any other word in the Quran except the name of God. So it takes the highest priority in Islam. It is central to Islam. And in the great days of Islam, knowledge was respected, scholars were respected. And when we talk of the madrasa, the religious school, people very often misunderstand and they're frightened of this word. And they say this is producing, it's a nursery for fanatics, for terrorists, for extremists. The madrasa simply means a religious school. It is like a Jewish school, it is like a Christian school. And in the great days of Islam, 1,000 years ago, the madrasas of Bukhara, of Samarkand, of Baghdad, of Cordoba, of Granada produced a stream of international scholars, great scientists and writers and artists, and they were the pride of the world. And they produced Jewish scholars, Christian scholars who could talk to each other, who could communicate with each other. And there was a meeting of civilizations. Just look at the history of Muslim Spain for this point. So we need to understand that something is going wrong in education in the Muslim world, that the madrasa itself is now in a crisis. And we here in America, the great scholars who are gathered here this afternoon, this great institution which provides us this platform like ISNA, we have to ask, how can we assist in repairing the damage? What can we be doing to repair the damage? Thank you. We need to better streamline the syllabus. We need to improve the teaching. We need to improve the facilities available. If we do not, then the stream that produced those people we call extremists and fanatics will continue to produce exactly the same kind of people. This is the fundamental first step that needs to be taken. And all of us, Muslims and non-Muslims, need to be aware of the role of education in Muslim society, which in turn creates an awareness of democracy in society, which in turn has an impact on the leadership and the kind of leadership that exists in the Muslim world today. This leads me to my next point, which is the role of the American Muslim. This is a role that is not very often debated or discussed, and which I really want to highlight this afternoon. Once again, it links what is happening here in America and foreign policy abroad. There are about 7 million Muslims here in America, as we know, and I believe that they can be of great assistance in all these points that we have discussed. in the creation and sustaining of democracy in the Muslim world, in bettering and helping education, and above all, in creating understanding between Islam and the West, in acting as a bridge between Islam and the West, as ambassadors between these two civilizations. The question I have is, have they been asked to play the role? Are they playing the role? If so, how effective they are? And my belief is that they need to be really encouraged to play this role much more actively. Let me give you an interesting example, a parallel. The United Kingdom, Britain, has about the same number of Muslims as does the USA. The same percentage. 7 million here, about 2 million there. In Britain, there are 7 members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. 7 members. The first time in history. Never happened before in history. Every year, the Queen's honor list has many Muslim names on it. The Queen of England recently, just a few weeks ago, visited a mosque. And for the Queen of England, because there's protocol around royalty, she took off her shoes as a sign of respect to the Muslim community. A small gesture, she made the gesture. Similarly, President Bush here in America visited the Islamic Center in the mosque, a gesture which was highly appreciated and immediately flashed all over the world. We need to encourage acts of high symbolic value like this, because these images are broadcast all over the world. And these images are helping shape the debate that is taking place right now in the Muslim world, where perception is forming that this is not so much a war against terrorism, but a war against Islam. So high technical weapons, bombing, raids, the latest weaponry could win battles. They do not win hearts and minds. And as Americans, as American Muslims, ISNA needs to be asking, how can we assist? How can we help? And mainstream America needs to be asking, how can we involve, how can we interact with an organization like ISNA so that we are advised and we are guided in this world enterprise that we are in the middle of? And are we really that different? Is Islam such a strange, exotic, alien system? Pause and think for a moment. What are the great American values that attracted you here, millions of you, to come to America? And we mustn't forget the Afro-American population who came to America centuries before the Arabs and the South Asians. There is a tendency for us to forget, to assume we brought Islam to America. Islam was already here, and it was here centuries ago, and some of the greatest figures have been produced in the Afro-American community. So what are the values that we can identify? Number 1, respect for education. Number 2, respect for family life. Number 3, respect for the dignity of human life. Respect for learning. And above all, respect for justice. These are American values, but these are also Islamic values. This is where America and Islam comes together. This is what needs to be built up, emphasized, and underlined, not the points of conflict. We know the points of conflict. We have to be thinking of the future, because, and when we think of the future, we need to remember the kind of century we're living in. We're living in the belly of a monster, which scholars call globalization. What does globalization mean? It means rapid change. To some it means Armageddon, such rapid change, not only to Muslim societies, to Jewish societies, to Christian societies, to Hindu societies. There's rapid change taking place in the world. Technology, information technology, transport, all these developments are unsettling traditional societies. There's a juxtaposition of the old and the new, of this society and that society. And in this cauldron, in this change, in the midst of this process of change, we need to be thinking of the larger picture and the global ideas that seem to be in play. And I identify two great global ideas that seem to be in play. One is called the clash of civilizations. It is an idea that is debated, discussed, propagated, and believed in by many, many people. Harvard professors, prime ministers in Europe believe in this idea. And at the heart of this idea is the belief that Islam is the enemy. And therefore, Islam again becomes absolutely important in the understanding of the clash of civilizations. Then there's an alternative idea, an opposing idea, and an equally well-supported idea, and that is the idea of the dialogue of civilizations. That dialogue is possible, that understanding is possible, that we need to live together as one human society, however different we are. We need to be able to understand each other, to appreciate each other. And in this dialogue of civilizations, let me point out that the man who introduced the idea to the United Nations was President Khatami of Iran. And this idea is firmly believed in by the Archbishop of Canterbury, by the Pope in Rome, by a whole series of people, Bishop Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela. We have some very distinguished, Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who recently wrote about this in the UK. We have some very distinguished people believing in this idea. I would like us to think in terms of these global ideas in play. And I would like us to think of what we can do as scholars, as activists on this platform at ISNA to encourage the idea of the dialogue of civilizations. And please remember, and I'll end with this, that the role of the media becomes critical in this, because people understand each other, know of each other through the media, what we see and what we hear. In the age of globalization, we don't have much time, so we switch on television and we are being bombarded by images. And unfortunately, these images, as far as Islam are concerned, are not very positive. So if I'm constantly being told Islam means terror, Islam means terror, Islam means terror, after a time I'll start believing this. Therefore, I would encourage American media to allow an alternative voice, alternative images in the media. It's not an entirely gloomy picture. Let me give some examples. History Channel, the History Channel on the 4th of September will be airing an important documentary called Inside Islam, a 2-hour documentary. I'd recommend you to see it. There's a rabbi in it, there's some very distinguished Muslim scholars in it, and it looks at Islam critically, objectively, historically. That is the kind of role that the media must play. Otherwise, those people who call Islam an evil and wicked religion, those people who abuse the Holy Prophet of Islam, are causing much more damage than they think they are. It isn't a question of damaging and hurting the Muslim population here in America. These words are sent abroad to the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world in Africa and Asia. And those people who believe in the clash of civilizations over there also point out that these people in the West can never be friends of Islam because they consider you believing in a religion which is evil and wicked. So they're causing much more damage than they think they are. And I would encourage them to read about Islam, to understand Islam, to talk to the scholars in Islam, and in that spirit to encourage the dialogue of civilizations. Let me conclude by referring to the Quran itself, and really it reflects the spirit of this afternoon session. God says in the Quran, there's neither east nor west. God is everywhere. And God goes on to say that God has made different tribes, different nations, so that we may begin to appreciate each other and wonder at each other, at the marvel of creation. It is this spirit that we need to, as human societies, recognize. And what the terrible and tragic events of September 11 have done is they have forced these questions on us. They have forced these questions on America. And on September 11, I believe Muslims should, in the spirit of reconciliation, in the spirit of Islam, go to the churches, go to the synagogues, go to the mosques, and pray for the departed and the families of those who remain, and create understanding and build bridges. And I will end by quoting an author I have a great deal of respect for, E.M. Foster, who wrote a book called A Passage to India. Some of you may know the book, and those who have not read him, I would urge you to read him. He wrote this book in the 1920s, and he wrote this book when the British Empire ruled most of the world, most of the Muslim world. And he dedicated the book, it's dedicated to a Muslim. Because E.M. Foster, the author of A Passage to India, believed in what he called, in the dedication to a book, only connect. Only connect. Connect as human beings, as civilizations, and as people. And this is the message I would urge ISNA, its delegates here, and the broader American public. Thank you very much.
May Allah bless you, Professor Akbar Ahmed. May I request you to switch off your cellular phones, please, because there are like 2,000 people here in this hall, and it helps to have quiet. My name is Hisham Altalib. I am a director at the International Institute of Islamic Thought at Herndon, Virginia. Also, I serve as a vice president of the Child Development Foundation. Now, we turn to the first discussant, Professor Mumtaz Ahmed. He is not the brother of Professor Akbar Ahmed. He's only brother in knowledge and faith. Professor Mumtaz Ahmed is a professor of political science at Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and has published 7 books and numerous articles on Islam and politics. He was also a member of the American Academy of Science Fundamentalism Project. He is the editor of a journal, Studies in Contemporary Islam, published by Youngstown State University in Ohio. He is also he was a past president of the Association of Muslim Social Scientists. We welcome Professor Mumtaz Ahmed.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It's my privilege to be here in this panel, particularly after coming Professor Akbar Ahmed. We share our last name, but unfortunately I do not share his depth of knowledge and breadth of perception. So you'll excuse me if I do not come up to his level of intellectual debate. September 11 forced Muslims to raise the question of their identity. The question of identity was whether they are Muslims living in America or were they Americans who happened to be Muslims. As far as Muslims were concerned, they were very clear in their own minds about their identity. For most of us, there was no contradiction, there was no confusion, there was no ambiguity. The confusion in defining Muslims was imposed on them. It was imposed by the media, which asked them very awkward questions, such as, who are you? A Muslim or an American? A question that the American media probably would never ask from any other quote-unquote ethnic group in this country. A young Muslim from New York said a couple of weeks after September 11 that he was so used to think about himself as a New Yorker that it took him a few days to register and to realize that when people look at him, they see in him the enemy of the city. Now, this feeling of estrangement was created by the fact that, one, those involved in the September 11 tragedy happened to be Muslims. Second, they claimed to do it in the name of Islam. And third, they looked like many of us, particularly immigrant Muslims. But for Muslims, the response was clear. The Muslims in the United States and elsewhere in the world condemned this heinous crime in the strongest of terms. But because the horror was so enormous, and every American saw the Twin Towers falling on their television screen, because the terrorists had Middle Eastern and Islamic background, naturally there are episodes of violence against Muslims, there are incidents of discrimination against Muslims or anyone who looked like them. As we know, several Sikhs became inadvertently the victim of violence because many people mistook them as Muslim. A Sikh friend of mine once told me immediately after that either you Muslims stop growing beard or we should shave the beard, because every time you hijack a plane, we get the beating. And this identity was like Mark Twain. You must have read Mark Twain's beautiful novels. In one of his novels, one of the characters says, "Who is a Muslim?" And his character, Tom Sayer, his answer is, "It's a person who is not a Presbyterian." Several incidents of violence took place, but the most striking thing after September 11 were not the incidents of violence, but the spontaneous outpouring of support from ordinary Americans, from community leaders, from politicians, from the mayors of the cities, from clergymen, from churches, from synagogues, and from the president who set the tone when he said that those who did it, they did not do because Islam is a violent religion. The important thing is that the tragic events created immense interest in Islam. In fact, those of you who usually visit bookstores, you must have noticed that Barnes & Noble had set up separate tables for the books on Islam. Islam became a very popular industry. But unfortunately, this interest in Islam was not in its own sake. It was not in its own right as a faith, as a culture, and as a civilization, but Islam was seen as a problem of US foreign policy, as a threat to US national security interests, and Islam as a source of terrorism. No wonder that almost every book that has been published after September 11 on Islam has Jihad, Osama bin Laden, and terrorism or Taliban on its title. Recently, someone went to speak, a friend of mine went to speak before a high school, and before he spoke on Islam, he asked the students to tell him what comes to their mind when the word Islam is spoken to them. Here was their answer: Osama bin Laden, Taliban, Afghanistan, jihad, hijacking, suicide bombing, veiled women, and Saddam Hussein. there was only one student who identified a positive symbol of Islam. Guess who? Muhammad Ali. In fact, it was precisely for this reason that I personally declined several invitations to talk about Islam in the wake of the tragedy of September 11. And the reason was that I thought that to talk about Islam and September 11 in the same breath is tantamount to implicate Islam with terrorism, which I refused to do. Once I was invited to speak on terrorism by a civic group in the area where I teach, and the topic was terrorism, how we can stop. I asked the organizers of the conference one fundamental question. I said, why are you inviting me to speak on this topic? Are you inviting me as a student of political science who has some interest in political violence? Or you believe that we Muslims have some special talent to explain terrorism? Or we have some special experience in terrorism? That's why you have invited me. The fact is, Islam is not on trial. Islam is not on trial for the crimes of September 11. Those who perpetrated the crime are on trial. And those who create conditions conducive for the use of violence, they are on trial. How can Hinduism is not on trial when thousands of Hindu nationalist fundamentalists go and kill hundreds of Muslims in Gujarat in the name of religion? And how come Buddhists are not on trial when Sinhalese Buddhists kill the Tamils? And how come Tamils are not on trial, who first introduced suicide bombing in modern history? It's not the Palestinian who started suicide bombing. One other thing that I remember from these 2-3 months after September 11 tragedy was that Imam after Imam and any Muslim who had any standing, public standing in Muslim community, was asked by the media first to denounce Osama bin Laden and then make a declaration on oath that Islam is a religion of peace. Everywhere I went and everywhere my colleagues went, they were asked to begin with this mantra. Islam is a religion of peace. Islam is a peaceful religion. We believe in peace. And this mantra of Islam is peace became such a standard refrain that it became a litmus test for us to be admitted into the American political discourse. In fact, I went to a conference in Jakarta in December where I was recruited in a panel on Islam and peace, and I said, look, I'm sick and tired of talking about that Islam is a peace. At least in Jakarta, spare me from this test. Anyway, for that matter, the primary value in Islam is not peace, it is justice. It is justice. And according to Islam, there can be no real and no permanent peace without justice. No matter how many Camp Davids you have, how many Oslos you have, how many other agreements that you may have, and how many Shimla Agreement and Lahore Declaration and Tashkent Declaration you have, there will never be peace in Palestine and in Kashmir until there is a justice for Palestinian and there is a justice for Kashmiri people. Let me conclude by making a few points about what the Muslim community will have to do to secure a better future for itself, to secure a better future for Muslims all over the world, and to contribute towards the strengthening of the moral foundations of this society. Professor Ahmed raised a question and he answered it very brilliantly. And this question was raised by President Bush, by several commentators here. Why do they hate us? And the usual answer given was, they hate us because they hate our freedom, our democracy, our pluralism, our Western civilization. Nothing can be farther from the truth. They, whoever they are, because they remain undefined, they are not angry because they do not like democracy, because they do not like pluralism, they do not like freedom and civil liberties. They are angry because they have been deprived of democracy, they have been deprived of freedom, they have been deprived of civil liberties and other things. They are not against Western civilization. Unfortunately, the West they have experienced is very much different from the West that the Western people themselves have experienced. The West, in the United States and in Western societies, it means democracy, it means freedom, it means equality before law, it means civil liberties, it means freedom of the press. For the third world countries, the West means colonialism. The West means multinational corporation. The West means Union Carbide. The West means exploitation of cheap labor by the multinational corporation. This is the clash of two perceptions. Dr. Ahmad said that why is it that in Pakistan such anti-American, anti-foreign violence is taking place? In fact, I remember in 1960s, early 1960s, the first time I went to Karachi, many of you would probably remember, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson visited Pakistan. He came from the airport. His procession was on the Drigg Road that connects with the downtown Karachi with the airport. There were more than 100,000 people lined up on both sides of the road. Vice President Johnson was in a limousine, and suddenly he saw a camel cart. He had never seen a camel cart. He asked the driver to side. He came out of the limousine, jumped into the camel cart in the presence of 100,000 people. There was no panic in his Secret Service. There was absolutely no worry by anyone that his life was threatened. Today, American embassies have become fortresses. American diplomats travel in armored cars. I think it's pertinent that the American policymakers must ask themselves the question, why this change has happened? Let me conclude by making a couple of points about the Muslim community, because we must see what's happening on the other side of the equation. There is no doubt about the fact that in recent decades, Muslim societies have witnessed the emergence of some very extremist religious groups who have extremely absolutist idea and vision of an Islamic society. I would go as far as to describe them as semi-fascist. And there is also no denying the fact that we have ignored these extremists among us. Brothers and sisters, we can no longer afford to do so. Ignoring them now will mean that we are condoning terrorism. Ignoring them now will mean that we are justifying the existence of those who have a propensity for violence. Let me be very clear and very emphatic on that. We have no Islamic and moral or political obligation to defend these people, these extremists, only because they have Muslim names. We must expose them in order to save Islam and Muslims from their flawed ideology, only to save ourselves. I'm glad and I'm proud to announce here that the Muslims of America, especially under the leadership of the Islamic Society of North America, made the correct moral choice based on Islamic universalism and based on Islamic principles of justice, and they condemned these heinous crimes in categorical terms. Because Muslims cannot believe my people right or wrong. On the issue of terrorism and violence and the killing of innocent civilians, whether Muslims or Jews or Christians, Islam took a very clear and categorical stand with no ifs and with no buts. Because no matter how just is my cause, and this includes the suffering and the plight of the Palestinian people, no matter which sheikh tells you, and no matter how long is his beard, there can be no justification for violence. There can be no justification for the killing of innocent Muslim people. Any person. I would also emphasize what Professor Ahmad has said, that the Muslim community in America is a great asset, both for the Muslims around the world as well as for the United States of America. They are the first line of contact between the US and the Islamic societies. They can explain the logic and rationale of US policies before their brethren in Muslim societies, and they can convey the concerns and the problems of the Muslim world to the US foreign policy makers. We can tell our brothers in Pakistan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Indonesia and Malaysia and Bangladesh and Nigeria, everywhere, that America is much more than Hollywood. It is much more than its foreign policy. It's much more than Pat Robertson and Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis and those who say that Islam is an evil religion. We can tell them that howsoever imperfect and inadequate, this nation was built on moral foundations. This is not perhaps evident to the outside world, and especially in the Muslim world, for whom America is a cynical power and its foreign policy is hypocritical. The world may remain unconvinced by the moral vision that the Americans have of themselves. But the fact is that America would be nothing without this moral perspective. Let the Muslim community contribute towards strengthening this moral vision and this moral foundation of this nation, no matter how cynical and hypocritical its policies may seem to us sometimes. Let me end this by narrating a very small anecdote. The day before the 4th of July, I called a friend of mine who is a prominent Muslim activist in the Midwest and just casually asked him, "What are you going to do on the 4th of July?" Listen to his answer. He said, "I will offer my prayer, Fajr prayer, the morning prayer, Then I will display the American flag on my rooftop. Then I'll have a big feast with my family where we'll all pray for the welfare and the prosperity of the United States of America. For me, it is this Muslim brother who represents the future of Muslim community in the United States. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for you, Professor Mumtaz Ahmed, for the deep insight. Our next speaker is Dr. Ingrid Mattson. She is an assistant professor at Hartford Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut. She received her PhD degree from the University of Chicago in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. She was a volunteer helping the Afghan refugees during the Soviet occupation. She is married and has a daughter and a son. And she is the Vice President of the Islamic Society of North America. Let us welcome Sister Ingrid.
Good afternoon. Peace be upon you. I praise God and I ask God's blessings on all of the prophets. It's clear from what we've heard that Muslims have an image problem in the United States. The survey that Professor Mumtaz Ahmed mentioned doesn't surprise me. It's also not surprising, I think, to know that there are surveys that have been done in the Muslim world, in Muslim countries, that show that the image that many Muslims have of the American government are similarly negative. But here I make a distinction between the government of the United States and the people of the United States. And to understand how easily governments can get an image problem, I'd like to relate a little story about when I was a child. I was born in 1963 in Canada, and I suppose I remembered this just over the last year. I suppose I was about 7 or 8 years old, a schoolgirl in a Canadian elementary school. And on that schoolyard, we used to play all sorts of games. We used to play Red Rover, hopscotch, skipping, London Bridge is falling down. And I also remember we used to have this little game where we'd link arms, try to get as many people as we could, and we'd link arms and make a line, and we'd take big, giant zigzag steps across the yard, trying to block out anyone who came in our way as we chanted, "Hey, hey, get out of my way. I just got back from the USA." Now, I have to tell you that my family used to go every spring break, pile the 7 kids in my dad's car. My father was a lawyer. Pile the 7 kids in the big Cadillac and drive 27 hours down to Florida to spend our spring break in Florida. Every year of my life, for about 10 years, I visited Disney World. I watched a lot of TV when I was a kid, and it was almost all American TV. So how could I possibly pick up this distorted caricature of the United States? I didn't even know what it was. I was 7 or 8 years old. I suppose it was around 1970, and looking back on it now, I know we had the Vietnam War was a very important issue at that time, and there were Americans who actually came to Canada to avoid the draft. So it was an emotional time. My point is that it is so easy for a government, for a state power, for the biggest power, political power in the world, to get an image problem that can affect how ordinary people perceive that government. And that's a problem for all of us because we need peace. Peace is absolutely indivisible in our time. We've learned that. We should have learned that 50 years ago with the development of weapons of mass destruction, and we're hearing more and more about the risks every day. We need understanding. And the first thing that I want to say is that the way that I understood what the United States was as I was an adult and came to appreciate it was by moving here, getting a scholarship at the University of Chicago, and appreciating the excellent endowments that fund public institutions and civil society in the United States. And living in this society and learning about the generosity on a day-to-day level of American people. So the first thing that I would like to offer as my small piece of advice is not to close borders, not to stop movement, but increase movement of peoples and travel and immigration and understanding, because that is the way that we will not have these rigid walls that will never protect us, but only prevent us from understanding each other. And related to that issue is my perception that we're not talking about civilizational or cultural clashes, because to me that doesn't even make much sense. Even though I've studied what the great scholar at the University of Chicago, Marshall Hodgson, called Islamic civilization, still he struggled with that. Is that an Islamic civilization? Does religion define the civilization? What about all the Christians and Jews who flourished under Islamic political rule? For me, Islam is a religion. It's my religion. It's not necessarily my civilization. I visited some countries that have Muslim majority populations. I lived in Pakistan for a year, although that was not really like living in Pakistan since I was in a refugee camp all of that time. And it's certainly not an Eastern religion in the way that we can say that there is the West, which is characterized by Judaism and Christianity, and Islam is an Eastern religion that defines another civilization. Islam is no more Eastern than Christianity or Judaism, because Jesus lived in Palestine, and the prophet Abraham spent much of his life in Iraq. They all of those prophets came from the same place, and that's why scholars of religion characterize these three faiths as the Abrahamic faiths, the faiths that are based on that urgent message of the prophet Abraham that only one God deserves to be worshipped. So we're all traced back to that holy land. But the Quran says that all of the earth has been made a masjid, a mosque, a place of prayer for the Muslims, which means that all of God's earth is holy. And when we reflect on the situation of today's world and we see that Muslims live in every part of the world, Christians are spread in every part of the world, this is a pluralistic, dynamic society, we understand that all of this earth is holy for all of us. And there's an interesting metaphor from my own life that I'd like to relate to that, is that when my Irish ancestors came to Upper Canada and to New York State, as they were called at that time. It wasn't called Ontario, it was still called Upper Canada in the mid-19th century. And I had relatives who came to both Upper Canada and the United States. The family decided to buy a large plot of land on an island right in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. And this land has been passed down through my family ever since that time for 150 years. Now, the generations we've gone through maybe 5 or 6 generations. You can imagine the number of children and relatives and cousins who are spread out on that land now. And what's interesting is that There's great diversity in this family, but even within my own family of 7 children, there are 3 sisters. And among the 3 of us, there is a Muslim, a Christian, and a Jew. And what's really interesting, and I think this must be God acting in history as God does to teach us lessons and give us signs, is that the land that we share is called Abraham's head. I don't know who gave it that name. I have to figure that out somehow. But to me, it's very significant. That little piece of land is just a metaphor for me for this world. We have to learn to live together. And we are living together. And we're either going to live together in peace and harmony that is worked for and struggled for and not easily achieved. And I'm not going to tell you that I've never had fights with my sisters. But still, we know that we can never cut each other off. We can never cut off our little piece of land and float down the river. That works in cartoons, but it doesn't work in real life. I probably tried it when I was a kid, so I know it doesn't work. That land is, even though it's an island, it's stuck down on the ground, on the core of this earth. But despite our differences, what can we do together? There is so much that we can do. The example of my family is this summer, all of our children, my Jewish nephew and niece, my Christian nephews and nieces, my Muslim children would go every Friday and raise money for an environmental organization, Lake Ontario Keepers, that's run by my brother, actually, and that benefits both sides of the river, the Canadian and the American sides of the river. That is a good deed that we can all do together. It benefits all of humanity. It's an action that's supported by all of our faith traditions, our ethical outlooks, that we are preservers of this earth, that God gave us this earth as a trust to take care of and hand on to the next generations. At the Islamic Society of North America, we're trying to build on a larger level similar alliances. So we have alliances to work on issues of poverty and homelessness and the needs of American people, ordinary American people, for health care. We're working with our partners in the NCCJ, in the National Council of Churches, in the other interfaith organizations, so that this is what God calls us to do, to vie with each other in goodness and to work with each other for goodness. Now, I also want to tell you another reason why something like a clash of culture or civilizations doesn't make sense to me, and that's because, you know, I live very comfortably in American society, and I'm totally comfortable in Muslim societies. I don't feel a stranger in either place. This is my land, and Islam is my religion. And when we look at American foreign policy and we think about the relationship between American foreign policy, the image of the United States, the image of Islam that's distorted in this country, there's something I'd like to point out. One of the most important issues that is raised is the issue of Islam and democracy, vying perhaps with first place with the issue of Islam and women's rights. Now, when Muslims came to this country, to the United States, they were absolutely free by the law of the United States and the Constitution of the United States to form any kind of religious organization they wanted, any formation, any structure, any kind of communities, as long as the law of the land was not violated, as long as they didn't inflict or violate people's rights. Now, Muslims could have made utopian, isolationist societies in the mountains, in the Rocky Mountains, or out in the deserts of Nevada. We could have hidden away, but that's not what Muslims did. Maybe a few here and there. But the vast majority of Muslims lived in the cities, the major urban areas of the United States, and they formed communities in the middle of the existing communities there, and they began building their institutions. And one of those institutions is the Islamic Society of North America. the oldest and the largest Islamic organization in the United States and Canada. What kind of organization did these Muslims decide to create? A representative, democratic organization. And who did these people, these Muslims, the majority of whom were born and raised in Muslim countries, who did they decide to elect as their vice president last year? They decided to elect a woman.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people assume that I got the vote because there was a Big Sisters campaign or because suddenly the youth had the vote. But I want you to know that the nominating committee was a bunch of distinguished elder men.
Not me.
Who, the majority of whom immigrated to this country 30 years ago, with roots in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, in the Sudan. So given the freedom to choose their own governing structure, their own representation, this is what Muslims have chosen. And that's why my final advice, if anyone would like to take it, to further peace between the United States and the Muslim majority countries is to help foster real, true democracy in those countries, not create it, because it's not our job to go in and create institutions in other countries. That's wrong and it will be resented. But to make sure that we don't provide support to those leaders who are suppressing the freedom and rights and wishes of the majority of people in that country. That's not democracy. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Dr. Ingrid Mattson. She added a distinguished flavor to the panel. May God bless you. Our last speaker is Dr. Louay Safi, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes after his presentation for question and answer. So please, if anybody has any question, can write it and send it to me. Dr. Louay Safi is Director of Research at the International Institute of Islamic Thought in Herndon, Virginia. He is the President of the Association of Muslim Social Scientists, and he is the editor of the Journal of Islamic Social Scientists, American Islamic Social Scientist. And he is an adjunct professor at George Washington University. He also serves as board member in the foundation of Crescent University, and he is a founding member and a board member of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. And he is a board member of the Center for Policy Research. We invite Dr. Louay to give his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Hisham. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. I'm going to make a few comments on the topic beyond the blame game between flawed U.S. foreign policy and distortions in the Muslim societies. Now, my colleagues who spoke before me addressed different facets of the problem. And one of those facets has to do with the self-image, self-perception, America's self-perception. And let me quote to you a distinguished American characterization of the United States vis-à-vis the world. Lawrence Summers, who served in the Clinton administration as a Deputy Secretary of Treasury, said the following. He said that, describing the United States, said the United States is the first non-imperialist superpower. Now, a nation that was born in fighting an empire is absolutely uncomfortable with the image of an empire. Imperialism is not something that we like to see as a description of our society, our country. Yet, this very description has been leveled against the United States by many nations, particularly in the South, in the developing societies. John Dewey, a great American philosopher, sociologist, and educator, once addressed this very issue. And in an article that was published in 1927, a long time ago in the Republic, he said that imperialism, I'm quoting, imperialism is a result, not a purpose or plan. You don't become imperialist by planning. What matters is how you go about conducting your business. The question that we have to attend to is also the question of sometimes the gap between intention and action, between purpose and result. And he went on to say that imperialism can be prevented only by regulating the conditions out of which it proceeds. If you would like to make sure that United States would not be driving toward empire building, then we have to see to it that our actions, our decisions, the way we behave vis-à-vis other nations are regulated in such a way that we don't all of a sudden wake up and find that, well, we have become an empire and we need great armies to maintain our security all over the world so that others would not attack us. Now, the United States, as we all know, has played a pivotal role in bringing about the United Nations and making international law something that all of us, all nations must prescribe to. Woodrow Wilson, a great American president, in his address right after World War I, the United States was dragged into World War I because of the fighting in Europe. But after World War I, Wilson was very instrumental in bringing about the League of Nations. Of course, the Congress didn't follow through. They didn't ratify the US membership in that organization. But then, after World War II, Truman and many great Americans worked hard to see to it that in order to put an end to war and to make sure that nations subscribe to international law, that they respect the dignity, the freedom of each other, that they respect self-determination of each other, there was a charter that brought about the United Nations. And this United Nations adopted international law as the law that everybody must respect so that humanity can live in peace, that we don't bring about a third world war. In World War II, for your information, probably most of you know that, 80 million people died, perished, in just 4 years. Now, since Woodrow Wilson invited the world to base its own interaction on law, on respect of the rights of everybody, Let me quote his statement that he made. A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike. Now, since this statement was made, the United States have shifted its approach to foreign policy. From those principles, let us recall that Wilson was the one who says, let us make the world safe for democracy. In his declaration of war statement before the joint meeting of Congress, he said that our mission as a nation is to make the world safe for democracy. Sadly, I'm sad to say that since that statement was made, we have shifted our attention. Now, the goal is to make the world safe for America. And this is not my statement. This is a statement, this was the title of a paper published as, and became later a blueprint by the Heritage Foundation, one of the most fundamental, most influential foundations, think tanks in this country. I just started. Now, I'm pressed by time, let me quickly go over the guiding principles today of US foreign policy. What kind of foreign policy are we pursuing? Because to understand that is very fundamental to understand where we are getting, what we are getting at, where are we going. There are three cardinal principles that guiding US foreign policy today. The first one, promoting freedom and democracy. This is the only morally defensible way to project our military force outside this country. This is the first principle. But then this principle is subordinated with by another principle, the principle of making sure that our national interests subordinate all other principles. So our national interest must come first. And our national interest today is defined in terms of economic and geopolitical interests. To harmonize the two, then we have come to what we call self-selective engagement. We pick and choose where we project our force. We pick and choose where we enforce human rights and democracy. And if we look carefully, the way we do it, we talk about human rights and democracy whenever we would like to promote our economic and geopolitical interests. What that has done to those little nations that are scattered throughout the world. And let me focus a bit on the Middle East, because I think our latest problems have been relating to the Middle East. In the Middle East, today, President Bush, Secretary Rumsfeld, the Vice President, are talking about another war with Iraq. But let us recall what got us to this point. It all started with supporting the Shah in Iran. The Shah was brought back to Iran by engineering a coup d'etat to topple down the government of Mohammed Mossadegh, a government that was elected by the people. We took that government out because it showed certain socialist leaning. We didn't like that. And so we imposed the Shah. And the Shah, with his repressive policies, created a revolution that declared the United States as the first enemy. And to fight that revolution, we armed Saddam Hussein. We gave Saddam Hussein all the power he needed. And when he turned his arms toward us, now we went to fight him and to destroy his army. And the first war, they didn't do it. Now we are going again. But my point here is that we are moving from one mistake to the other. And we are doing that because we are not true to our own values. If we supported democracy in Iran in the first place, the revolution that came to hate us would not have come. The Iranian would have matured politically and maybe became later our friends. But we didn't do that. So we again went to the second phase of Saddam, and we are stuck there. The chair is asking me to conclude
You should obey, I hope.
my talk, and he is a very dear friend of mine.
Obey your elders.
Okay, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to conclude by proposing an alternative. Do we have to continue on the same path? What got us to that path to begin with? How come that a nation that cherishes civil liberties, human rights, democracy is seen outside as supportive of very repressive autocratic regimes? If a nation that cares about freedom is supportive of those who are taking away freedom from their countrymen. What got us to that point? The answer is two words: political realists. There are scholars and thinkers who have been really trying to convince us that this is the only way to go about. And what they have done to us is that rather than making the war safe for democracy, now our democracy is being shaken before our eyes. We see in the various enactments that have come after this horrific terrorist attack. And I don't have time to address that issue. I was planning to talk about our response to terrorism, but in respect of the chairman's wishes, I'm going to avoid that. But what I'm suggesting, that really what we need to do is to ensure that our foreign policy is one that is like the local policy, the national policy. If we don't like those who really avoid the law or think they are above the law in this country, we should not allow them to rule in other countries. And many of them can't rule without support. Many of them, if we withdraw our support, they will topple immediately, but we sustain them. If we don't like it to others, we cannot, if we don't like it to ourselves, we can't do it to others. That's a very important principle. And I think we are in a position as the sole superpower today to change our behavior, change our foreign policy, to make sure that we don't allow those who are our allies to commit atrocities and excess. And we don't call that terrorism even when it is targeted against civilians, but we call any resistance to those atrocities terrorism. Even terrorism, we haven't defined terrorism. In this country, we haven't defined who are the terrorists.
I'm not going to define it tonight, so may Allah bless you, Brother Dr. Louay Safi, and thank you very much for your thoughts. And right now, we'll start with answering questions. I chose to give each speaker a few questions, and they will read the question and answer so that we'll save time. Would you like to stand up there, Doctor?
I have a whole host of very good questions. Some I'll answer very briefly. Write the titles of your books. There are too many to write. I'd simply recommend Discovering Islam or Islam Today, both available here. One question talks about the economic and political situation in the Muslim world. Again, this question is addressed in detail in the books I mentioned, in Discovering Islam and Islam Today. It's a lengthy answer, and I don't think we have much time. A question said that should we not pray for the departed souls of the thousands of people killed in Afghanistan, the children and women, because of the US relentless bombing? Yes, we should pray for all these innocent victims, whether in Afghanistan or in the Middle East or in Pakistan. We should really pray for humanity. I don't think we should make boundaries around who is dying. Too many innocent people are dying in this age of ours. The final question is about the minds and hearts of the younger generation. What could be done to win them over? Because hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent on this effort. Is it being successful? And can it be successful without the American Muslims? I believe it cannot be. I believe that United States foreign policy must recognize the American Muslim community. It must not see the American Muslim community as a fifth column. It must not see it as potentially a dangerous and hostile presence within the country, which unfortunately is the impression being conveyed by certain sections of the irresponsible media. At the same time, the position has to be reversed. The American Muslim community, as I had mentioned earlier, are the greatest asset of America in its interaction with the world outside. These are the greatest ambassadors. These are the greatest bridge builders. Take the example of Muhammad Ali. He's a great American icon, but he's also a great Muslim icon. That's one name throughout the Muslim world that people identify: Islam, America, great, and the greatest. I believe a name like that, sent abroad to the Muslim world with delegations of distinguished Muslim scholars, women, spokespeople, will make a big impact. Karachi, Cairo, Kuala Lumpur. Here is a great American, here is a great Muslim. This is the effort that needs to be made. On a personal level, again, we must at all our own personal levels make this effort. We are talking of global issues, issues that are really beyond our control at best. We can only suggest things. On a personal level, the notion of interfaith dialogue, repeated, so that the message becomes relationships. I'll give you a small example from my university, the American University here in Washington. I ran a course called Religion and International Relations last term, a very successful course. I had wonderful young kids in my class, Jewish, Christian, some Muslims, some from the Arab world. And in one class, I had Rabbi Kenneth Cohen, who's the chaplain, the rabbi at the university, and he spoke to the class and he said, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we are like three sisters. And as Professor Ingrid just told us so beautifully, three sisters are always fighting. Sometimes they love each other, sometimes there's affection, sometimes there's a quarrel, but we are part of the same family. Then I had a very eminent Muslim scholar, Professor Suleiman, from Saudi Arabia, and he said some beautiful things exactly in the same spirit. I would like to see this dialogue repeated in public, here, and in the Muslim world, so that Muslims see this interfaith dialogue in action. We are not seeing enough of this, and this will continue to keep this great gap, which is, I'm afraid, increasing between Islam and the West. My final point, personal gestures, personal symbols. I gave the example of E.M. Foster, his book being dedicated to a Muslim, Sir Ross Masood, who incidentally, for those of you from South Asia, is the great-grandson of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who created Aligarh University, that great institution that created generations of scholars and writers for South Asia. In my own very little way, I've reversed this. I have dedicated my book, the new book which has just been finished, to Professor Lawrence Rosen of Princeton University. I'm sure if he ever hears about this, he's going to get a shock. He'll sit up in his chair. But that is a small gesture, and it's been dedicated because of his scholarship and his friendship. And I think it's these personal gestures we all have to make. So September 11 is a date that has woken us up, woken the world community up, and let us move in that spirit of dialogue into the future. Thank you.
Dr. Ahmed.
I have two questions here. The first question is that Muslims have a great difficulty in expressing their honest opinion about U.S. foreign policy. That's detrimental to the interest of the United States. Also, any opinion that's not in line with the media lines is automatically projected as unpatriotic. My response is that as citizens of the United States, we have certain obligations. And the most important obligation of citizenship is that we must make sure that this nation does not deviate from its moral and ethical values. My patriotism does not require me to support every policy of any administration who is in power in Washington, D.C. My patriotism requires that I try to correct the mistakes that I believe will be harmful for the United States. That's how I would respond. The second question was asked about the U.S. relations with Pakistan, and a brother wants to know that Pakistan has been a friend of the United States for a long time, but this was not reciprocated by the United States. What's the present state of relationship? My answer is that you must have seen President Bush's response after the recent constitutional amendments issued by President Musharraf. He said, and I quote, I'm still tight with Musharraf. Now, if tight is used in the Texan sense, we have some hope. But if he used the term tight in what the Pakistanis mean, God save us.
Thank you. Dr. Mattson, please.
I'm going to answer a question that is relevant to this panel, which is foreign policy and American Muslims. And I want to say that I'm not, like Dr. Louay Safi, a political scientist, so I don't know all of these things. I don't understand all of these political things. But I do know a few things about, I've studied a few things about morality and ethics. And it's clear to me that what Dr. Safi was saying at the end about wanting for the other nations what we want for yourself is basically simply the golden rule. And that's something that is a universal, foundational, fundamental principle of every faith tradition. And for those, there's a secular version of it too, which is reciprocity. That should be so clear and understandable to everyone that I don't think it requires any further explanation. And that is my response to the question, what can American Muslims do to become a bridge between East and West? I don't think we can be a bridge between East and West because as I say, I don't look at the Islamic world or Muslims as Eastern. Certainly there are problems between East and West. I was in a very large Far Eastern country this summer that is not a Muslim country, and one of the people I met along the way, who was one of the drivers of one of the vehicles I was riding in, who was not a Muslim, who was not a religious person, in fact, at all. I believe he was an atheist, from what I could understand, had a screensaver on his mobile phone, and it was a screensaver of Osama bin Laden. So there are problems between the United States and the East in general, between the developing world, between other countries, and we can't solve all of those. But I can say that in most of these situations, in all of these situations, reciprocity and the golden rule is the underlying principle. Thank you.
Well, as you know, I don't make time, I only abide by time. The session is already 3 minutes late. Now, Dr. Louay will answer very briefly the questions with him, please. Huh? You can follow. Okay. One of the audience is asking about the film, the documentary, Mr. Jinnah, The Making of Pakistan. It is available at Astrolabe in the bazaar. Well, I think you all agree we really have to thank these distinguished panelists. So let us thank them. And I thank all of you because you have been very patient and very good-looking audience. The session is over. However, the convention continues till tomorrow noontime. Please, the next session will be at 8:15. Thank you. Peace be to you, and good evening.
Thank you. I was not able to understand your question. The question I had. We have to address it.
It's over now. It's over now.
No, just my perception is that the Americans obviously hijacked the Jewish lobby. And the proof of that, there were a lot of selections.